It's a time of our service where we collect an offering. For those attending MCC through our YouTube page, you too can participate by going to our website at mccboston.org and clicking on the donate button there for that purpose. Thank you for being a part of our church family. Members and friends of MCC Boston, while it is true that this church continues to struggle, we need to remember that God's plan is not often obvious, and we need to let our faith and trust in God lead us forward. Our founder, Reverend Dr. Troy Perry, has frequently quoted his Uncle Roy, who reminded him throughout his journey of establishing the MCC Fellowship that a coward dies 1,000 deaths, but the brave dies only once. As a fellowship, we've come to learn that we only do a disservice to ourselves and to God by shrinking into obscurity and denying gifts meant to empower us to do God's work. UFMCC organized its first demonstration in March of 1969, only 5 months after the first worship service was held. A local man had lost his employment simply for being gay, and the church knew that God was calling him to speak out against this injustice. After the protest, one church member literally had to have his hands pried loose from the placard stick because he was frozen by fear. The next time the church demonstrated, they were bolder and began carrying the placard, "We're not afraid anymore," which at the time was used to help bolster their own courage, but today is a statement of fact. Our early church history has taught us how paralyzing fear can be and how true liberation from transphobia and homophobia can only arise by being bold visionaries for Christ. For 47 years, MCC Boston has been empowering members of our communities and reminding them that they need not be afraid anymore, that God has created them in God's own image, and that they are living their lives just as God intended. This evening, MCC Boston stands at yet another crossroad, and just like 51 years ago, this church needs to be bold in its mission of carrying out the work that God continues to call us to do. Our inclusion within the GLBTQI communities is not accidental. God has uniquely positioned each and every one of us to carry out this work. We do not serve God through meekness, and certainly by not ignoring God's call. As a church community, God calls us into boldness. So this week, consider what you might do to help enable MCC Boston to be bold in its mission.
First reading is from 2 Peter 1, 16 to 21. For we did not follow cleverly devised myths when we made known to you the power and coming of our Christ Jesus, but we have been eyewitnesses of his majesty. For he received honor and glory from God when that voice was conveyed to him by the majestic glory, saying, "This is my child, my beloved, with whom I am well pleased." We ourselves heard this voice come from heaven while we were with him on the holy mountain. So we have the prophetic message more fully confirmed. You will do well to be attentive to this as to a lamp shining in a dark place until the day dawns and the morning star rises in your hearts. First of all, you must understand this, that no prophecy of Scripture is a matter of one's own interpretation, because no prophecy ever came by human will, but by men and women moved by the Holy Spirit spoke from God.
The second reading is from Matthew 17, verses 1 through 9. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly, they saw Moses and Elijah talking with him. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Teacher, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, "This, my child, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to Jesus." When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Tell no one about the vision until after the chosen one has been raised from the dead."
Epiphany is about light, about illumination, about revelation. As we travel these Sundays, we discover the significance of Jesus, whose birthday we just celebrated. We learn about how the baby born in Bethlehem is also the light of the world, as well as about how we, as his followers, are also called to be light. We are drawn more deeply into an understanding of who and what the infant greeted by shepherds and the Magi is for us and for all the world, and about our role to share what we have learned. A former professor, Dr. David Lowes, says, "I like to think of the Christmas message as a tightly, even intricately packaged Christmas gift, which takes us the whole of Epiphany to unwrap and discover." Okay, so he's a bigger church nerd than I am. Transfiguration Sunday brings this season to a close. And today's account provides the nearly perfect bookend to the story of Jesus' baptism that we read on the first Sunday of Epiphany. Make no mistake, transfiguration is a strange word, one that you almost never use in everyday speech, except Alan says that word every single day. And Transfiguration Sunday isn't all that much more familiar, and it's easy for us preachers to underestimate how little our congregations know what to make of this day. I was in that position once upon a time. It is the final Sunday of Epiphany, which is perhaps the least understood season of the church year. The relationship to the baptism of Jesus, the first Sunday of the season, is clear, as we are again invited to listen to the crowds at Jesus' baptism and the disciples here at the Transfiguration, to a voice from heaven announcing, "This is my child, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased." At the same time, Transfiguration leans unmistakably into Lent, which begins Wednesday, as Jesus comes down from the mountain to head to the death that he speaks of during that very descent. The command to listen to Jesus, addressed to Peter, James, and John, will become poignant, even painful in the weeks ahead, as they regularly fail to do just that, or at least fail to understand what they're listening to. And those same words, when taken as addressed to us as Jesus' latest disciples, orient us to listen and to watch as the sovereign of glory approaches destiny in Jerusalem, so that we might more fully comprehend God's purposes and work in Jesus. And as if this weren't all enough, or if all this weren't enough, Transfiguration also foreshadows Easter, when the disciples fall to the ground in holy awe. The glorified and glowing Jesus comes to them, touches them, and commands them not to just stand up, but literally to be raised. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Jesus then commands them not to speak of this event until he himself has been raised, this time from death. There is something about this day, this event, that just can't be understood until after the resurrection. We are not alone in our confusion about Transfiguration Sundays, as biblical scholars also regularly fail to understand the role this scene plays in the larger gospel narratives. It comes something out of nowhere. It is not clearly connected to what comes before or after. Now after 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John, his brother, led them up on a mountain by themselves. This was 6 days after Jesus had predicted his coming death and resurrection, and rebuked Peter for only thinking about the things in this world and not about the things of heaven. It is followed by more passion predictions and the continuing story of Jesus' ministry in and around Galilee and his impending journey to Jerusalem. Clearly a mountaintop experience, it is nevertheless challenging to see how this story contributes to or advances Matthew's narrative of Jesus. For this reason, we can probably focus with confidence primarily on the details of this story. One of the things I like about the first gospel is that the author is good at painting pictures with words. Unfortunately, some of those pictures just don't come through in the English. The story of the Canaanite woman in Matthew 15, which I believe we'll do later this year, is illustrated like an opera, but you can see that only in the Greek. Today's gospel text uses words that have meaning beyond what can be translated into English, but I'll still try. Are you ready for your Greek lessons today? Get lots of it. These three disciples, Peter, James, and John, knew Jesus only in human form, but he was more than that. He wanted the disciples to see him in his heavenly glory, or majesty as the Peter text calls it, so that they could better understand him. Jesus needed to demonstrate his deity, divinity, or his holy being to his disciples. It was Jesus' choice to reveal this to his inner circle of disciples and us. Jesus' clothes became dazzling white. Here's your first Greek. Phos Luca, literally white light. Jesus was clothed in light. Now you gay guys, calm down about a guy just clothed in nothing but light. I sometimes describe this as Jesus being a human light bulb. A fluorescent light bulb, or tube, has a coating inside the glass that is excited by the current that runs through the gas. This causes the coating to glow. It is the coating on the outside that makes the light. Perhaps this is similar to being clothed in light. I'm trying to bring a miracle and light it up. It's not working. Now, Peter's reaction may seem odd to you, but some biblical scholars suggest that it is an appropriate cultic response to what is an epiphany, a demonstration of divine presence. Peter's use of dwellings is skenos, which is a tent, a tabernacle, or a stage. It brings up an inference of Shavuot, the Jewish festival of weeks, booths, or tabernacles, depending on which group you're in, and coincides with the giving of the Ten Commandments and the revelation on Mount Sinai. These dwellings are a means by which to offer lodging and hospitality for these historic and significant religious figures. Others see in Peter's suggestion less a cultic response and more the desire to preserve the event, to capture and prolong something of the magnificence of the moment. Still others, and I am in this group, have been struck by this as a characteristic of Peter and many of us. When we encounter something beyond our reckoning, our first inclination is to do something, anything. And there are those who feel this is another way that Peter, like many of us, tries to tell God what to do. However you read the motivation for Peter's suggestion, it is notable that in Matthew, the voice from heaven actually interrupts him, cutting him off in order to first pronounce Jesus blessed and then to command the attention of the disciples. Whatever Peter or we may have been thinking, there is only one thing that is needful. Listen to him, the beloved one. The bright cloud, or photenos, or Greek, aren't you glad you came here tonight? Means it was full of light. The light was radiating out of this cloud. Imagine a cloud that doesn't block the sun, but is actually brighter than the sun. And this covered Moses. It was much like the cloud that covered Moses and the mountain. The disciples fell to the ground. And here, since it's a very long series of words, I'm going to leave out the Greek. But literally means they fell on their faces. Ouch. Jesus touched each one of the disciples, an action that is usually used in this gospel for healing. This is exactly what Jesus does when we reach the very bottom of life or when we are fearful or frightened. Jesus touches us and tells us not to be afraid because he is with us. He promised that he would always be with us. The very last verse of this gospel is, "Remember, I am with you always to the end of the age." Then he said, "Get up and do not be afraid." Again, I'm going to leave out the very long Greek here, but the Greek is more literally, "Be raised and fear not." I can easily picture them being lifted by Jesus' power alone, which is why I chose that song. The word for "be raised" is also used of Jesus' resurrection. So I will leave the idea of disciples being raised for you to ponder on this evening. When all this is over, when Moses and Elijah are gone, the voice is quiet, Jesus' faith and clothes have returned to normal, and the disciples are left in holy awe. All that is left is Jesus. Whatever the signs and symbols may have meant, the disciples are once again with their master, their teacher, their friend. This is perhaps one of the signature characteristics of Matthew. Jesus, the one whose face and clothes shone like the sun, the one equal to Moses and Elijah, the one whom the very heavens proclaim as God's own beloved child, will not leave them. It is worth noticing a difference between Moses and Jesus here. Moses brings the law off the mountain. Jesus brings his body, which will be broken for you. When all else fades, and indeed soon enough the world will become dark indeed, still Jesus remains, reaching out in help, comfort, and healing. Christ is there both at the mountaintop and at the valley floor, at both altitudes and all of those in between. Jesus is there, sharing our joys and our fears, reaching out to raise us to life again. At the very close of Matthew's account, he will gather with these and all of his disciples on another mountain and promise that he will be with them even to the close of the age. Be raised and fear not. I am with you always to the end of the age. Amen.